My name is Chiara Delmonico, and I am the Manager of Business Development for Women's Health at UC Health and University of Colorado Hospital. And the Let's Talk Conversations about Women's Health, as you know, is a partnership between UC Health and the Center for Women's Health Research. Is that better? Thank you.
And I'm Judy Regensteiner. I'm Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Women's Health Research at the University of Colorado. And together we've been partnering for several years now between the University Hospital and the University of Colorado to produce and present these programs to the public. And we've been very pleased at the response, and here we are tonight.
Yes, thank you. Tonight we're going to add to our partnership some really outstanding faculty and team members. David Stevens is a meditation specialist, longtime friend of mine, and I'll introduce him formally when he speaks. Dr. Kevin Masters, and we'll give a formal introduction to everybody when they bow to speak. Dr. Laura Borgelt from the Skaggs School of Pharmacy, and Matt Vogel from the National Behavioral Health Innovation Center. So thank you very much. Would you like to say anything else?
Just that the Center for Women's Health Research has the three-part mission of doing cutting-edge research in women's health and looking also at sex differences and primarily cardiovascular disease and diabetes, although we're now interested more and more in mental health because separating the body and the mind is not even practical and not the right way to go, we think. So we're interested in physical medicine and mental health. And our second part of our mission is to mentor and train the next generation of researchers in women's health, young physicians and PhD scientists who want to do this important work, our workforce in women's health and sex differences. And third, and why we're here tonight, is to educate the public and healthcare providers. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
I'd like to tell you a little bit about UC Health. We now employ more than 17,000 physicians, nurses, and support personnel whose mission is to improve patients' lives and serve the people of our community each and every day. UC Health is new, but believe it or not, we've been serving Colorado for generations. And we have grown to a large healthcare system with several hospitals across the Front Range and affiliated hospitals in Nebraska and Wyoming, and a very strong network of outpatient medical care, which provides more than 2 million visits a year in the Rocky Mountain region. So we're very proud of that.
For the two of you that are sitting there, I think there are a couple of seats up here, so not to single you out or embarrass you, but you might find better seats. Right up there, that end seat is empty.
We have a few housekeeping issues. Enjoy your dinner. Feel free to get up, walk around. There are restrooms behind me and down on the main floor, the first floor, basement level. Silence your cell phones. We will be taping this. And in your folder, you will find an invitation, some information about David Stevens and Yoga of the Mind, and a full bio on all of our speakers. And we are going to leave the Q&A session for last. So you have a notebook, you can write questions down, and we'll leave a good amount of time for questions, Q&A. So some of you received a pre-event survey, and we had long discussions about this, a just-in-time survey, and Dr. Borgelt has used this type of teaching in her teaching at the Skaggs School of Pharmacy. And we asked, what did you want to learn? And I'm going to just read a couple of the things, the themes. One thing to take away that will encourage me to move forward with optimism while dealing with a past trauma. Another person wrote, having a bias against the popular use of marijuana, I'd like to hear a medical perspective on its use. Regarding mental health, they want ideas to manage aging and support family members with depression. The next was tools to help healthcare providers deal with current pressures of running a practice. No time for healthy behaviors, but it's important to find ways to do work and ways to recommend to patients to be healthy as well. Many people said, I want to find meaning in life. I want to maximize my life. I want to be motivated to spend more time on my health. And another person wrote they'd like to know methods to participate in exercise and mindfulness even when I have a very basic schedule. More than one person wrote about the election. How can we deal with the stress of the election results? And how can one support or reach out to someone with a mental illness who who has estranged himself to friends and family. And how can one find resources and what specific steps to break addictive and self-destructive behaviors, wanting tools to feel better and calmer about the future? This is a very serious topic that we've decided to put together. And what we do after each Let's Talk is we send a survey to our participants. And over the years, since 2011, this topic has been coming up and coming up. And I think we finally found the panel to do the best job to address this. So without further ado, would you like to say anything else?
No, I want to thank our partners at UCH for partnering with us. It's been a wonderful collaboration.
Sure has. Thank you, Judy. Okay, here's our little answer. David, be introducing you. So please welcome David Stevens, Yoga of the Mind. One of the primary goals of Yoga of the Mind is to stretch and strengthen and balance our inner abilities for personal awareness and growth. And I'm going to go off script here and tell you that David Stevens has been my friend and teacher of meditation for 10 years. David has taught me countless tools to be present in my life and to live a meaningful life. And David has also helped my husband as he moved through a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. And he's healthy and well today. And I believe that that has to do with the work, the healing work, and the meditation work. So healthcare might not have all the answers, but there are other alternative methods. Please welcome David Stevens.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see, am I on here? Volume? Maybe we're not. Oh, there we go. Very nice to be here. Not used to working in the round, but we were commenting, we kind of feel like we're at the United Nations here. So, but you need your plaque saying what country you're representing. So just for my own information, how many people here have not yet meditated? If you could just hold your hands up for a second, and it's going to take me a minute to circle around here. Okay, well, we're going to change that in just a couple minutes here. I've meditated all my life. I grew up in the New Age Center of Pueblo, Colorado. So, which if you know anything about Pueblo, it's kind of the opposite of Boulder. So, but I became interested in it in the early 70s and have practiced it very consistently ever since. I've explored many different methods, and I'm going to be sharing a couple of very simple things with you today that you can take with you. So when I teach meditation and talk to people about meditation, I hear two things. I hear, well, I know I should do it. There's lots of meditation, there's lots of research about transcendental meditation, about mindfulness meditation. And so people think, well, it's something I should do. And then the second thing I hear is, I can't do it, it's hard, I can't make my mind go blank. So what we're going to be doing here, we are going to be doing about a 10-minute meditation, and we're not going to try to make our mind go blank. We're going to give our mind something to do so the natural calming of the meditation can happen. And I like to say we are broadening the mind. We aren't focusing the mind. Nearly everything we do in our life is pay attention, focus, 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 effort, effort, effort. We're exploring the other direction. Effortless intention. So, and let's see if there's anything else I need to say. No, I think that's about it. So if you don't mind putting your spoon or your pen or whatever is occupying your hands down. And let's go ahead and, it helps too if you can put your feet on the floor. And this will be a very simple, it will be our Yoga of the Mind, mindful meditation. Take a deep breath and exhale very fully. And let's do that one more time. Nice, easy, deep breath. And then exhale very fully. For the rest of the meditation, we'll just focus on having a continuous flow of breath. And that means if at any point you realize you've kind of minimized or suspended your breath, then just go ahead and start breathing in or breathing out. The suspending your breath will tend to make your attention wander. It's also part of a stress response. And what we're doing with this meditation is we're developing a new neural pathway, which is the opposite of our very well-worn flight or fight response. We'll be doing some visualizing, and some people visualize very perfectly. Others, it's just kind of a vague idea, or they might just feel or know that they've mentally created something. And any of those will work, so don't be hard on yourself for anything during this meditation. So become aware of the base of your spine, sacrum, and then just imagine that there's a line of energy going down from the base of your spine, through the chair and through the floor, and through whatever floors there are to this building, through the crust of the earth and all the layers of the earth, to the center of the earth. I've taught this to thousands of people, but I'm always impressed. I just notice a settling, a calming that happens as we all, in our imagination, in our visualization, connect ourselves to the center of the earth. So this is the simplest form of our meditation, is just having the flow of breath, easy in, easy out, and mentally creating that connection with the center of the earth. And you don't have to continuously focus on those things. You can just kind of let your awareness notice what you notice. We'll do this just for a couple minutes, but if you do this on your own, you can do it longer. Just notice if you have thoughts, don't try to push them out. Just let them be there, but also don't give them a lot of significance. If you notice emotions or physical sensations, good or bad, just let them be there. Let them be like if you were laying on your back in a big field of tall grass and you're just watching the clouds move across the sky. Just for a moment, notice the flow of breath and notice that connection to the earth. Some people just kind of notice it as just acknowledging gravity. And just notice what you notice. There's a saying in the meditative community, be here now. So we're just going to do a little bit of other work in our imagination to help us be more present. So the grounding and breathing really helps. Another thing that could really help is, let's just imagine that out the door, out in the hall, there's this big bubble of energy. And let's just go ahead and put all the stuff we did today, all the things we didn't do today, all the stuff we have to do tomorrow, all our concerns with it being after a surprising election, Sure, that's activated some current concerns in you, so they can go out there. And you could really have the next 2 hours be a sort of meditation. If at any point you find yourself lost in your own thoughts about all that stuff, don't try to completely eliminate them, but just put them in that bubble out in the hall. Some people actually associate a color with the different thoughts. It just kind of depends how you internally process. Notice the flow of breath, and notice that grounding, that connection to the earth. And for the next few minutes, we're going to just mentally say the word to ourselves, peace, as we breathe in. And then as we exhale, just for a moment, say the word mentally to yourself, ease, as you breathe out. So we're breathing in, we're invoking, we're welcoming the quality of peace as we breathe in. And then we're sending that as the vibration of ease as we breathe out to our whole body. With peace, out with ease. I'll be quiet for a bit while we just continue with that. Same thing if you have other thoughts or other sensations or emotions. It's not a problem. It's kind of mechanical. Just peace as you breathe in and ease as you breathe out. In with peace and out with ease. And I'll just mention, this is a meditation. I know some of you work or teach here at university that you could do here. It's a very beautiful campus. It is a bit spread out, so you might find yourself walking from building to building. And you could, just as you breathe in for 4 steps or whatever works with your breathing rhythm, you could just say that word peace and then mentally say that word ease as you breathe out. It can even help even if you're just moving from one wing of the building to the other wing. You can have that be a few minutes of reaching deeper level of calm. one more minute of breathing in peace. Breathing out ease. And let's go ahead and just gently open our eyes. Okay. People find that to be a pleasant experience? Was it hard? Good. Good. And we teach a lot of other things at Yoga the Mind, but this is one that I could share in a brief amount of time. And we'll have to do the questions later. But yeah, thank you so much for this. And remember, you can do this. You could even do it waiting in line. Waiting in line is often a very frustrating experience for us, but it's something we do. So rather than having that 5 minutes you're in line be, why is there a line? Why don't they have more staff? Whatever. Then you could have it be 5 minutes of helping yourself. And I believe that if we all practice this, the world would be a more peaceful, cooperative place. So thank you so much, and please use this.
Thank you, David. If you have a seat available next to you, can you raise your hand? We have a few guests who are looking for a seat. David, thank you very much. I think you've set the tone for the evening that we can all come together and leave outside and learn inside here today. Meditation has brought together corporate executives, yogis, techies across the board. Everybody is seeking the same thing, and it's one way that we unify ourselves with our neighbors, is to understand we're all looking for the same answers. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Kevin Masters, and he's the professor and program director of clinical health psychology, editor-in-chief of Annals of Behavioral Medicine, past president, Society for Health Psychology. And Dr. Masters is a clinical health psychologist and a leader in the field of health psychology and behavioral medicine. Dr. Masters is currently involved in researching, examining meaning-based interventions for individuals with heart failure and how meaning and purpose may be leveraged to increase adherence to healthy behavior regimens. Dr. Masters is generally interested in studying cardiovascular processes and disease from the perspective of behavioral health, as well as the relations between spirituality and religiousness and health. Dr. Masters probably had a very difficult job creating this unique lecture on happiness and meaning in life, and he's done an incredible work, and I'm really excited to listen to what he has to tell us today. Please welcome Dr. Kevin Masters.
Well, thanks very much. I'm honored to speak to this group. I've spoken to lots of groups, but I've never spoken to a group quite like this one before. And so it's really an honor to be here and to see all of you. The other thing that's interesting is speaking in the round. Now, they told us that we would be speaking in the round, but truthfully, I didn't believe them. I thought, well, they mean semicircle is what they mean. But they actually mean in the round. So the notes are here. I'll have to just carry them along with me. But seriously, I'm really pleased to be here and to share with you a little bit. It is going to be fast. There's lots of slides, but they're going to go by quickly. I'm glad that David got you all nice and relaxed for this, because now I will probably rev you up maybe a little bit. But, you've got a little room to go back up now maybe, so we'll do that. But thanks so much for this opportunity. And this is a line of research that we are really excited about doing. And so hopefully some of that comes through. I will talk a little bit toward the end about some of my own work. And largely we will talk about work that colleagues have done around the country and around the world. So the title is Live Like You Mean It, Does Meaning Matter for Health? And the first thing I need to do is recognize who I really consider to be my co-presenter tonight, although she's not with me. and that is Stephanie Hooker. Stephanie was my graduate student for quite a few years. Excuse me, not because she was slow, but because I left Syracuse University and came out here about halfway through her career and threw her a curveball with all of that. But it was really a good move on my part because I got to keep her around a little bit longer. And Stephanie's just done amazing work, and she really is the person who kind of moved me in this direction. I'd been doing work that was really about meaning without ever calling it that for a long time. And Stephanie really kind of said, let's just study it. And so we really started doing that. And you'll see that she is the co-author on some of the work that we'll talk about later. Stephanie's currently doing her clinical health psychology residency in Chicago. And believe me, we're trying every way we can think of to get her back here as soon as she's done with that. She's fabulous. The other thing I need to do is thank our funders, the American Heart Association, and also the Office of Research Services at CU Denver. The Anschutz Health and Wellness Center, where I also have an appointment, has been very helpful with us in terms of getting research participants and also just brainstorming and thinking about all of this. And then my graduate students in our CALM Heart Lab, CALM stands for Cardiovascular Life Meaning Heart Lab. They are all just fabulous, fabulous people to work with. So we're going to start off with some morning questions, even though it's not the morning. So let's have our first morning question. I'll ask you the question. You don't need to answer out loud, but just think about it for a little bit. And here's our first morning question. Why did you get out of bed this morning? Thought for a minute. Well, I have another morning question. Am I making people seasick walking around up here? Sort of like we're on a boat, kind of rocking. If it's getting you a little queasy, send your hand up and I'll try to hold still. Okay, so here's my second morning question. What would have been a better answer to my first morning question? In other words, how would you have liked to have answered that question as to why you got out of bed this morning? Well, it's not morning, the day has gone along, and so I have some during the day questions for you as well. Our first during the day question would be, how aware were you today of what's really meaningful in your life? Or were you aware of it at all as the day went along? And then our second during the day question, how much were your actions today indicative of what is meaningful in your life? So if we followed you around with a little secret camera, would we have any idea what you consider to be meaningful if we just saw the kinds of things you were doing today? So those are some of the questions that we are thinking about in our research, and we'll return to some of that in a few minutes. But the first thing I guess we need to do if we're going to talk about meaning in life is solve that question once and for all. And so, of course, the way you do that is if you want to know the meaning of life, you, of course, try Googling it, because that'll give you the answer to everything. But I actually didn't Google it because I was afraid of what I might find. And so I went into the research literature. And, you know, when we try to research things like this, now I should be clear and say that for human history, I think people have thought that meaning was important. But it's not the easiest thing to study. And for most of human history, in fact, until about the last 10 years, nobody really in psychology or medicine was studying it. Philosophers talked about it a lot. Theologians talked about it some, and so forth. But we weren't studying it empirically very much at all. Now we're really on kind of a wave where this is starting to get studied quite a bit. But if we're going to study something, we have to know what it is we're studying and how it's defined. And so the answer I'm going to give you to how this is defined comes from Heinzelman and King's recent article. But what they've really done is kind of summarize how the researchers are talking about it. So you can sort of take this as kind of a general sort of answer to this question. And they say that a meaningful life is one that, first of all, has purpose. Second of all, it has significance, or it matters to the individual who's living it. And third of all, it's comprehensible. It makes sense. It's in some way has some predictability to it. Or kind of summarizing that, a colleague up at Colorado State, Mike Steger, says, meaning provides us with a sense that our lives matter, that they make sense, and that they are more than simply the sum of the seconds, days, and years that we're alive. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about life meaning. But then the question that I'm raising is, does any of this matter for health? And what I'm going to do now is just list for you some findings from research studies throughout the years. We've found increased longevity among older adults, studied over 5 years. This effect was the same for men, for women, for Caucasians, and for African Americans. Improved physical health correlates with higher sense of meaning, better self-rated health and functioning, and also greater positive affect or positive mood and feeling state. Some other findings: better psychological and physical well-being. And this is an interesting one, actually, lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. This was a study over 7 years, and they compared people at the 90th percentile or higher on their measure of meaning with those at the 10th percentile or lower, and those at the 90th percentile were 2.4 times less likely to develop Alzheimer's symptoms and disease over that 7-year period. One other question we might have, okay, but does meaning matter for women's health in particular? And the truth is that the research that's out there so far on meaning and health in general is not voluminous by any means. In fact, you would characterize it probably as a series of one-shot studies in various areas. And the same is true when we look at specifically at women's health. And many of the studies have not actually broken this down and looked at women's health or men's health separately. But we do have some findings. Women polio patients had higher purpose, with higher purpose, found that predicted less of a decline in their health over time. Older women with higher purpose, in older women, higher purpose was negatively related to risk of persistently low sleep quality. And fibromyalgia patients who were females, they found that purpose predicted increased pain tolerance and less disability. Now, to this point, all of the studies that I've talked about are just single studies. But it would be nice to find a study that takes all the studies and puts them together to see, well, what do they find as a group? And that's what just happened in Cohen and Bavashi and Rosansky's study that came out just this year in the Journal of Psychosomatic Medicine. It's a meta-analysis, and so what they do in a meta-analysis is they take previous studies, they put them together, but they can actually calculate an effect based on what's in those other studies. And so by doing this, they were able to take 10 prospective studies with a total sample of 136,000 participants, and they followed them up over a period of about 7.3 years. And I left the numbers in here just in case somebody really wants to see these numbers and knows about relative risk and adjusted relative risk. So they're there for you if you want them. If you don't want to pay attention to them, we can just read it, which is that higher meaning actually predicted reduced all-cause mortality in this sample, and higher meaning also predicted reduced mortality or reduced cardiovascular events, whether they were fatal or not fatal. So that's a pretty substantial finding. It's not a finding that you would say, is certain for all time and eternity, but it is a pretty solid piece of work that they've pulled together for us. So if we could conclude that meaning does have something to do with health, and that meaning really does matter, then the question we would probably have maybe is, well, why? I mean, why would meaning matter? How does it really make any difference? How does it get under your skin and affect your health in some way? And there are a couple of thoughts about this. The first thought is that maybe people with higher meaning actually experience stress differently or better. So perhaps people with higher meaning, for example, don't experience as much stress. Life's little nasties are maybe just not as nasty if you are really focused and thinking about life having a purpose. I mean, really, does it really matter if the guy butts in front of you in line? I mean, in the big picture of life's meaning, that's kind of a no-starter, isn't it? But in the picture of your daily hassles, which, by the way, daily stressful hassles are better predictors of poor health than big stressors that happen relatively rarely. So in other words, we do let this little stuff get under our skin. When I was driving over here today, I was changing lanes on the freeway. And I put on my blinker. There wasn't a ton of room, but there was actually plenty of room. I started to move over. The guy behind me, who clearly saw I had my blinker on, decided he would go over as well. And I made the mistake of thinking he was actually going to be courteous and let me over. So I started over, at which point he gave me the horn. And for just a second, I kind of went ballistic inside, for just a second. And then I thought, but wait a minute, I'm talking about meaning tonight, and really, does this really matter that this that this fellow citizen, did this? No, it doesn't really matter, does it? So perhaps people with a high sense of meaning, they just don't see events as stressful. Or perhaps when they do see them as stressful, they recover from them a little bit better. So I do a lot of stress research. And in the stress research, we talk about two things. We talk about reactivity. That's your initial response to stress. So something happens, and all the catecholamines and the chemistry, and it all starts just running through your system, right? You have this response. But the research shows that's not good for you. But it's even worse for you if you do that, and then you ruminate about it for a while, and you keep it running through. Because really, that guy that cut me off, he could actually not only ruin that minute, but he could ruin the rest of my day if I thought about it all day, right? I mean, I could really keep myself fired up for quite a while over that. Well, maybe people with a sense of meaning, maybe they recover better. So perhaps they react less, or perhaps they recover better. And there's not a lot of research on this. This is research that we're just itching to do in our lab. We have a brand new faculty member who's young and hungry and smart, a perfect colleague, and we're looking to do a lot of this kind of work. But there is a little bit of it out there, and I'm going to show you a study now. And I debated whether to leave these slides in because the slides are busy and the study is complicated. So we're going to skim through it, and then if you're really interested, we can come back to it in a little bit. This is a study looking at meaning predicting better emotional recovery from a negative stimulus or from a negative stress. They looked at participants in what's called the Midlife Development in the United States, or the MIDAS study. In this study, they particularly looked at 243 individuals, 147 female in their mid-50s on average. They completed surveys of meaning and other dimensions of psychological well-being, which is an interesting part of the study. And then on average, about 2 years later, after they had completed these surveys, they came into a lab where they were going to be stressed. And the question was, how would they react to the stress and how would they recover from the stress? And would that be predicted by any of these psychological variables, including meaning, that they had studied a couple years previous to that? Now, the stressor that they did is really, it's a complicated procedure involving pictures that arouse affect and a noise that startles you and makes your eye blink. And you might say, what does any of this have to do with stress? Well, it turns out that this eye blink response is really a very nice little measure of sympathetic nervous system activity. The sympathetic nervous system is the well-known sort of fight and flight that gets you going. And so this is kind of a tricky little way of measuring this sort of stress arousal effect, and without asking you to do it or without measuring more obvious sorts of measures. And if you have a shorter recovery, if there's a shorter amount of time to recovery, then you have less stress. That's basically it. Okay, so they bring them into the lab, and here's what they found. And this is an interesting little scatter plot. If you follow the line, it's trending down. And what that's showing is basically the higher scores on purpose in life 2 years earlier are predicting less of a stress response in the lab. Now you have a couple of outliers there that could pull things around a little for you. You can see like that one person up at the top. But if you pull the outliers away, you actually get even a little bit cleaner picture of what happened there. So why is this study cool, and why did I spend a few precious of my minutes on it? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is it demonstrates an effect over 2 years, which is sort of interesting to see. Now, if you're a nitpicky methodologist, you're going to want to ask me questions about that, and I'm going to say you're right. But nevertheless, you would only be supposing in the absence of data, and I'm supposing in the presence of data. So there, I win that one. The measure of emotional recovery in this study was kind of an interesting one. because it's not something that you can readily manipulate. If I asked you, well, how stressed did you get and how much did you recover? You might, I don't know exactly what I'm getting when I ask you that. You're in my study, I told you I was on a stretch, blah, blah, blah. But this eye blink response, you don't have much control over it. So this thing is really kind of getting at something that you couldn't really be controlling. And this was really interesting. It was only meaning and purpose that produced the effect. None of the other psychological well-being measures, and you can see them listed there, they didn't have the same effect as meaning and purpose did, which I find that to be a pretty interesting finding and suggests that there might be something specific or unique to meaning and purpose. But there's a second way we might go about this question of why meaning matters, but why. And a second way it might matter is that perhaps people who are living with greater meaning actually engage in more health-related behavior. And you can see the quote I put up there from Carol Riff. Carol Riff is an amazing researcher at the University of Wisconsin. And she, at the bottom of that quote, says, simply put, taking good care of oneself in terms of daily health practices presupposes a life that is worth taking care of. So do we have evidence that people that have a higher sense of meaning or life meaning, they actually do engage in better health behaviors? And the answer is we have some. This is a 2014 study that I've put up on the overhead, the Health and Retirement Study. They've looked at a little over 7,000 individuals over the age of 50. They tracked them out for 6 years. And over that time, they found that people who at baseline scored higher in the sense of life, meaning, and purpose actually were more likely to obtain a cholesterol test, to have a colonoscopy, to have a mammogram, a pap smear, and a prostate exam. So we do have some evidence in that direction. Now, Stephanie and I got interested in this because we've been interested in physical activity. If I asked you, do you think physical activity is good for you? Kind of a non-starter, isn't it? Everybody thinks physical activity is good for you. But then we have that little problem that you have to do it for it to work. And that tends to be a little bit of an issue. And we wondered, well, would meaning and purpose, people that had higher, would there be any connection here? And so we did this I think it's an interesting study. We did this study where we looked at 104 adults, 71% of whom were female, average age in their mid-30s. They completed self-reports of meaning in life, of potential confounds with meaning in life, like depression, optimism, sense of control, and mood. Now, that part of it might not seem too important to you, and perhaps it's not, but when you do this kind of psychology research, if you don't control for confounds, then a person who is maybe a big positive mood researcher comes along and says, well, your effect is just because people felt better. It's not because of meaning. And so you have to try to control these things and see if you can figure it out. To some extent, it's just us academics, in an echo chamber yelling at each other that people maybe don't really care about all that much. But to us, it's important. But it doesn't mean that these are bad things because we call them confounds, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And these people wore accelerometers over 3 consecutive days, a sort of transition day, and a Saturday. And what we found was that there were positive relationships between meaning and total amount of movement. Accelerometers, by the way, if you're not familiar, they're just devices that you wear on your hip, and they measure movement. And they can measure movement in several planes and so forth. We thought that was better than asking them again for all those reasons. After we controlled for the potential confounds, the relationship was maintained. So we did a reasonably good job of saying it wasn't just because they had better mood some days. And also there was a similar trend which surprised us a little bit in terms of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So it wasn't just moving more, but it was also actually engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that was interesting, but then we decided, well, so far we've been measuring meaning as kind of this big cloud in the sky sort of thing. And the scales, people will answer questions and they'll, how much meaning do you feel you have in your life? And it's really sort of big and global. And it's producing some relationships that look interesting. But we really started thinking about a proximal cause. Remember those questions I asked you earlier? Is meaning something that's really impacting people in the moment, in the day that they're going through? And so we started trying to think about, well, some of these questions like I asked you at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of the talk. How aware were you of what's meaningful to you today? How much were your actions indicators of what's meaningful to you? Could you find more meaning in the activities you engage in? Another way that this might be more salient is not necessarily changing what you're doing, but changing how you conceive what you're doing. Is what I'm doing just giving a talk tonight in Colorado? Or is what I'm doing actually a fairly important part of my life, and that I'm sharing information that I feel is meaningful and important with an audience of folks who are maybe interested in it? Different ways of thinking about the exact behavior. Well, we went back to kind of the beginning of all this and looked at some of the work of Viktor Frankl. You're probably familiar with Frankl for his book, Man's Search for Meaning, but he actually wrote a book called The Will to Meaning, which has a little more of the sort of precise thinking that he did around this idea of meaning. And you can't really see my highlight there very well, but what Frankl says is meaning of life differs from man to man. Now, Frankl wrote back in the day when that was the language, so sorry about that. But from day to day and from hour to hour, what matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but, and this is the part that we found important, rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. And I thought, well, I just don't remember thinking that about meaning in life or about Frankl. Now, maybe you did, and I'm slow to the table. That's possible. But I thought, well, that's interesting. What do we think about that? What can we do with that? And we've kind of developed our own sort of construct that we haven't seen in the literature that we're calling meaning salience. Awareness of meaning in the moment. How does meaning matter into my day right now? Does it matter in terms of decisions that I'm making? Does it matter in terms of behaviors that I'm engaging in? Or does it matter maybe in terms of how I'm viewing the moment? Do I view it differently as a result of having a greater awareness in the moment of what's meaningful to me? And we're sort of toying with some terms, maybe calling this mini meanings, moment-to-moment meetings. I'm not sure what we'll come up with exactly, but this idea that, it doesn't have to be only at the great, big, huge event in life that you think about meaning, but it could be something that infiltrates your day. Maybe when you're doing the breathing exercise, for example, you would incorporate that. It'd be a nice way of doing that. So we decided to study this a little more. We thought, well, if people are more aware of their meaning, will they be more active in the days that we measure as we measure that? So we're going to measure this day by day. We did a study of 160 previous sedentary adults who wanted to start physical activity. That's the PA. Most of them were females, most of them, again, in their mid-40s, joining a health and wellness center over here on campus. We followed them for 3 months to assess their physical activity adoption, and for reasons I won't go into, but half of them were randomized into completing daily surveys for 28 days, and they completed a measure of meaning salience, mood, and physical activity. After we controlled for daily mood, meaning salience was positively associated with daily minutes of physical activity, intensity of physical activity, and likelihood of attending the fitness center on that day. So the higher the rating of mood through that day, the more likely they were to do these various things. Now, everything I've presented to you to this point is observational. It might be observational over time, it might be observational in the moment, but everything's observational. So another question we have is, well, can we intervene with meaning? Can we do anything about this? And we've developed a study called Colorado Meaningful Activity Program, COMAP, where we're trying to intervene to determine if we can make changes, excuse me, not only in meaning, but also in other variables, including health variables. So the first thing we do in this intervention is we interview people to determine what it is that, in fact, they find meaningful. And we also want to know what health behaviors they want to change and when they might be looking to change those behaviors. For example, you want to be more active, you want to do more walking. Well, when could you do that in your day? Well, maybe I could do that at noon instead of going to lunch or as part of my lunch break. Okay, good. And then we try to link what's meaningful with these health behaviors, because we find that people will do a lot of things when it's in the service of something big or something important, and won't tend to do it quite so much when it's in the service of their own health. They'll recognize it as good, they'll give it a go, but they'll have a hard time sticking with it. And so we're trying to link something important. Maybe it's important for you to stay active because you would like to see your granddaughter get married. Or you'd like to be able to go to Red Rocks with some friends and be able to walk, or whatever it might be. And then we're using smartphone technology to provide these messages that are tailor-made, individualized, at particular moments in time when they might be important for the individual to use them. Now, what I'd like to do is put up a graph at this point that shows you our brilliant success in doing this. And I'm sure that eventually, if you invite me back, I will have that graph for you. And I won't just make it up, it'll be true. But so far, we haven't gotten quite that far. We've only pilot tested. We have some very good testimonials. I'm going to skip past these because I want to be respectful of the time. So trust me, they say we're great. And let's see here. But now we need to get to what you've probably been thinking about, which is, of course, the elephant in the room. Actually, with this topic, we have more than one elephant in the room, but it got crowded in that room, so we just used one elephant. And here I think is the elephant. So if I don't feel life is so meaningful, what can I do? Now keep in mind, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm not even a game show host, really. I'm just a psychologist that does my research, and we look at what we can find in there. But we have found some stuff in positive psychology research over the last 10 or 15 years that's been amazingly consistent. Whether what you were looking at was meaning, or it was happiness, or it was life satisfaction, we found some pretty amazing results. I'm not going to go into those results, but I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from some folks who have looked at this. And one of them you might recognize is from Atul Gawande. He wrote the book Being Mortal. A few years ago, my sister-in-law recommended it to me, and I thought, I know it's important to look at end-of-life issues. I don't want to look at them right now. So I started reading the book anyway, because I thought, well, she's pretty smart, and her book recommendations are usually pretty good. And then the joke was on me, because what I found out was reading about end-of-life issues wasn't reading about end-of-life issues at all. It was reading about my issues today in my life and tomorrow in my life. Because it turns out that when you get to the end of your life, if it's been a meaningful life, it's going to be quite a different ending than if it hasn't been. And Gawande has some interesting, really, if you haven't read that book, you owe it to yourself to read it. It sounds like a bummer, being mortal. But really, we knew that anyway, right? We knew that we were mortal. So it's really a well-done book. And this quote, I think, is really interesting. The answer, he believed, is that we all seek a cause beyond ourselves. This was, to him, an intrinsic human need. It could be large, it could be small, but the important thing was that in ascribing value to the cause and seeing it as worth making sacrifice for, we give our lives meaning. He, in this instance, was an individual who was doing a kind of changing things up in a nursing home in ways that you'll need to read the book to find out. It's really an interesting book. But the cause beyond ourselves, that theme comes up over and over, not only in the philosophical sorts of literature, but actually quite strong in the psychological literature that's looked into this. Another interesting comparison was in a book by David Brooks called The Road to Character. And Brooks talks about two types of virtues, resume virtues and eulogy virtues. They're all virtues, they're all good things, but they're different things. So like resume virtue might be to conquer, whereas a eulogy virtue might be to serve. Or create and accomplish on the resume side, building up your resume with all that you've accomplished. But on the eulogy side, maybe you see a purpose, a sacred purpose that you want to serve. On the resume side, how is it that things work? On the eulogy side, why do things exist? And why are we here? Going forth and venturing, or maybe returning to roots and family. And then finally, sort of success on one side versus charity. Again, not saying the resume side is bad, and there are certainly many times, I like to build mine up, and all of us in careers are doing that. But is it to the neglect of the eulogy virtues? What are people really going to say about you when they're delivering the eulogy? And then finally, I want to go back to Frankl for just a second. I'm not going to read through this whole quote. You can kind of read along. It's probably better actually for you to read it and not listen to me for a minute or two, and then we'll kind of come back together here in a minute. But that last sentence is pretty good. Self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. This has become one of the strongest findings in the positive psychology movement, whether you're talking, and you can put different words on it, but basically what it's showing is if you're trying to make meaning for yourself, you're not going to get there. You're going to get there, though, when you transcend yourself and you get focused on some cause or purpose or other person, and then suddenly you say to yourself, now I feel life's pretty meaningful to me. This is really different, from our psychology of 40 years ago. But it's actually showing to be a rather robust finding. Daniel Gilbert wrote a book, Stumbling Onto Happiness. Daniel Gilbert is once an undergraduate at CU Denver, now a professor at Harvard. You may know him from the insurance commercials where people come and pin things up on an investment thing or whatever it is. That's the same person. But he's done some amazing research, and his book, Stumbling Onto Happiness, is really an interesting read I recommend to you. But you may wonder, well, what does self-transcendence look like? And it actually turns out I have a picture. This is actually what self-transcendence looks like. Now, this is a person by the name of Tommy Neal. I'm going to guess that none of you know Tommy Neal, but I know Tommy Neal really well. It turns out that Tommy Neal was that person in my life when I was an adolescent. You're an adolescent and you have your parents perhaps, and my dad was a great dad, but he was my dad. He had the power to ground me, right? To take away the keys. But Tommy Neal, he was like a dad, but he wasn't going to ground me. In fact, he told me how good I was and how it was great to be with him and how accepted it was and that I always had a place at his house. He was kind of like a second dad, really, in a way. And he continued to be a second dad. My own dad passed away in 2006. And then Tommy really kind of stepped up and became a dad, even though I'm getting by that time in midlife. And then I found out on Monday morning that Tommy had passed away, sort of surprisingly. Didn't see it coming. And I'm going back tomorrow to Cincinnati to his funeral, and I was thinking, boy, I'd really like to speak at his funeral because he meant so much to me. And I'd like to tell people how much he meant to me. And besides, I'm a professor. We talk all the time, so I'd probably be good at it. We think we get paid by the word, so we talk a lot. And this would be great. And then I was on Facebook, which I'm never on Facebook, but stumbled on Facebook, and I saw this post from a friend of mine, Kim. And Kim was talking about Tommy and how amazing he was. And she was recalling stories of when she and Kathy would get up on Saturday mornings and go with Tommy into the inner city of Cincinnati and hand out candy and invite these inner city children to Sunday school the next day. And he would then drive an old beat-up school bus that was an act of faith to think it would even run, and pick up these kids and bring them to Sunday school where they would get a meal and, participate in Sunday school and so forth. And how much he meant to her. And then I thought, well, I don't have a chance of speaking at his funeral because, in fact, there's 30, 40, 50 people out there like me that Tommy had this impact on them. I couldn't figure out how to close this talk, and then I thought, about 2:30 in the morning last night, this is how you close the talk. You talk about someone whose life was meaningful, who was self-transcendent, who had an impact. And, people always say he always had that smile, and you kind of wonder, really? Well, he really did. He always had that smile, and that smile was really because we were smiling at him and how he was making us feel. So what's the secret to meaning? I don't know all of it, but I know part of it. Part of it is that kind of self-transcendence. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Masters. That was amazing. I love working here. I love being part of the research and you know, many of the slides that you had up were in preparation, in preparation. Well, just for a moment, you know something that the rest of the world doesn't. And when you publish it, we'll all know it. You're going to start seeing a lot of research come into everyday, his research come into everyday talk. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Laura Borgelt. Let me switch this. She's the Associate Dean of Administration and Operations at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy and professor in the departments of Clinical Pharmacy and Family Medicine at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Dr. Borgelt's teaching, practice, and research focuses on patient safety and women's health as an educator, researcher, and clinical pharmacist at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus and A.F. Williams Family Medicine Center. She has worked for over 20 years with many medical residents and primary care providers to build interdisciplinary collaborations, innovation for patient care models. Her initial interest in educating providers and patients about medical marijuana started about 7 years ago when she was asked a clinical question about use in pregnant and lactating women. I'm going to allow her to begin her talk.
Great. Thank you. All right. So I've been tasked with the task of answering a question about whether or not medication is a means to health or not. And I will tell you, I needed medication this morning when someone tried to drive me off the road on the highway on I-70 today. I'm just kidding. When Kevin was talking about his talk and what brought meaning, I was thinking about what was it that got me out of bed. But as I was thinking about this talk, I thought, how many of us consumed something to help us get out of bed today? We had coffee. We took a pill. We did and had a medication of sorts, right? Many of us did that. Now, that may not have been the reason we got out of bed, but it helped us get out of bed and get going and all of these things. And it was really striking to me about some of the things he was talking about in terms of having meaning in life. I'm feeling like, is something going on with my microphone? Am I okay? I'm okay? Okay, right here is good? In having meaning for life, how many of us are using medications to enhance that? Or maybe allowing us to have meaning? And as a pharmacist, I'm going to tell you that no drug will help us find that. But medications may help us live longer, different lives, right? Different doesn't always mean better. Different can mean worse. But it's important, I think, as a kind of on this next step of the journey and talking about meaning and happiness, how medication plays into that. And I have, I think, a very unique perspective in that I've been trained as a pharmacist, but I work in a family medicine clinic. And in that clinic, I work with providers to really help them be better prescribers. That is my job, is to help them be better at what they are prescribing for you and you and you in your everyday. Do I do a good job? I try. But I see a whole range of patients in a family medicine practice. And when we look at what's happening around our world and how long we are living, the United States, I thought it was highlighted here. Do you see where we fall? Fourth from the bottom. We think we're at the top. We're not. And what's causing that are a lot of different things, primarily heart disease, which we hear about. You know, if I could wear red every day, I would, because that go red is a sign of that. And when we look at other things, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, we know so many of these conditions are killing us. And we use medications to try to treat it. Now, this is a national survey published, our most recent data out of the CDC, looking at the different types of medications that we use. We see anti-cholesterol medications at the top. What's number 2? Antidepressants. What's number 3? Analgesics. And I'll tell you, I don't have it here because this is men and women data. Do you know where hormones fall? About 4 and 5. What is that telling us? Forget the cholesterol for now. We want to feel better. Right? We want to feel better. And when we look at antidepressants and analgesics, which is kind of where I'm going to go a little bit here, the antidepressant data is very, very interesting. Because, and I'll liken this to antidepressants and hormones. How many people get better on placebo? Any guesses? 60, not quite that high. 30 to 40% of people get better on placebo, even with hot flashes. And I'm not kidding. Okay? And there are data, even with antidepressants, to say they might be as good as placebo. When we look at analgesics, the FDA-approved therapies move us on a scale of 1 to 10 from a pain level of 7.4 to 7.1. And they're approved. Is that a little or a lot? Right? So it's an interesting concept. And so I think when we look at the types of medications that we're using and whether or not they're really effective, I don't know if medications are a means to health or not. The cholesterol, I have a hard time arguing. The statins are pretty darn good. But it's these two categories I'm really kind of focusing on today. And we know that opioids is a huge health epidemic. And I could talk all night about the opioid overdosing that we see. And we know that it's quadrupled since 1999. We know prescriptions for opioids have gone up significantly. And the most common drugs are methadone, oxycodone, and hydrocodone. Okay, and you'd have to be living in a hole to not know that there's an opioid epidemic, right? And when we look at the states by which there are a number of painkiller prescriptions more than any others, where do you see Colorado? More towards the bottom. This is per 100 people, right? But we know in Colorado, it's a huge problem. Places like Florida, it's a significant problem. And this just kind of shows you the number of painkiller prescriptions per 100 people. And what do you notice about those dark purple states and the numbers there? They're the red states, so that's a good observation. There might be a good reason for that then, huh? The point is, I love that. The point is that there's more than one per 100, there's more than one per person. It's 1 point something per person in these places. And so we are seeing potential looks towards medical cannabis as an alternative potentially to our pain, to our depression, to our anxiety, to those things that where we want to feel better. And I'm here to tell you that cannabis is also not the answer. But I want to share with you why it's interesting. Does that sound good? Okay. So when we look at opioid use, there is this data that was published in JAMA. Now there are, just like Dr. Masters mentioned, there's a lot of flaws in data. This is observational data, epidemiologic data, and you can see in the blue line the states with medical cannabis laws, and in the black line, states without a medical cannabis law. Now you will notice that there actually are more deaths in states with cannabis laws overall, right? But the part of this line that gets interesting is from about 2009 through 2010, and now since then as well, where we're seeing less opioid-related deaths in those states that have the laws, and an increase in opioid-related deaths in those states that did not have the laws, okay? And what they saw in this study was that there was about a 25% lower overdose death rate in states with laws compared to those without. And beyond that, as the time from when the laws were started, that association strengthened over time. And what that means is it's just an association. It is not a cause. Do you understand the difference? Okay, the association of the laws being there means that maybe there was the lower opioid death, but it was not caused by that necessarily. So as laws go, there's more or reduced opioid death. Now, if we look at other surveys that have been done, this one came out of Michigan, primarily in patients, 244 patients, primarily with fibromyalgia, but other pain conditions. And they looked at a lot of different parameters here. And what they found, and I'm just going to show you a few of these things, their opioid usage went down by 63% when they started using cannabis. Their degree to which side effects of the medications affected their daily function went from a 6.4 to 2.7 on this scale of 1 to 10. And the number of medications used went from 2.3 to 1.8. Now, I'll be the first to tell you this is a very biased sample. They all are using cannabis. They wanted to use cannabis. I mean, there's a lot with that. But when I see opioid dose changes of, in my practice, 50%, 60% aligning with these numbers, it's interesting and compelling. It makes me wonder what's happening. The quality of life also improved by 45%. Now remember, these are people who are having severe pain. Okay, so they're fibromyalgia patients, typically full body pain as well. So a lot of this fear really of opioid use, of prescription medications, has led patients to really consider something like medical marijuana. Now I've mentioned pain and depression. What are other reasons that people use medical marijuana? Relaxation? What was that? Philosophy, sure, have a good think, right? What else? Sleep, anxiety, boredom, nausea. What was that? Peer pressure. And as an anti-inflammatory, we've got rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, seizures, migraine headaches, MS, muscle spasms. I mean, every one of you could come up with something different by which it's being thought about, okay? And I think a lot of it comes from just our not feeling good with what we have, okay? Now, every person has a story. This is a little bit of mine. I did not intend to be a medical marijuana expert. It wasn't even on the radar. But as Kira mentioned, I have a very strong interest in women's health and patient safety, and I work at A.F. Williams, which is on the corner of like Quebec and MLK. And I'm in clinic one day, and a resident came into the clinic that day, and she said, I just spoke with the patient. She's a breastfeeding mom, and she's smoking a joint per day. Like, that's interesting. Then the resident said, and I told her that was completely fine. And I sat there in my chair, and I said to myself, I'm pretty sure that's wrong, but I don't know if it's right. And it was that one moment in time that kind of started this whole course, right? And so I'm sitting there in the precepting room. This information comes to me. I look up what little information is there. I report back to the doctor. The doctor tells someone at the Colorado Medical Society that I'm an expert. I gave one talk, and I became the expert. So you see, you know how these things go. Now, some of that was that I was interested from a woman's health point of view and from the patient safety point of view. So Eric actually married these two interests that I had had in a very weird, convoluted way. But that's how it came to be. And so I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, is this really what I want to do with my career or part of my career? And I thought, well, I'm qualified as a drug expert to talk about drugs. And so I've started on this path, and I have to say, I don't have an opinion. If people want to use marijuana, that's their choice. I prefer they not drive high. But my responsibility is to help them be educated about responsible use and what they are getting into if they choose to use. That's really the position that I take, and it's kind of a hard one because people assume that I must be some wild marijuana advocate. I'm actually not. But I think it's important that we be educated about it. So opportunity is knocking, and here I am. And it's my one kind of key opinion is that I do think the medical use of marijuana is very different than the recreational use. In medical use, we are truly balancing benefit and risk, and I'll go into that in a little bit. With recreational use, we are intentionally impairing ourselves. Are you with me? It's a different mindset, a different purpose, and a different intention. And for that reason, it becomes important for me to discern some of that. Now, I will be the first to say that overlaps. Sometimes people who have extreme pain just want to feel good. So it can overlap. Feeling high may be a helpful effect for what they're looking for. That gets a little bit blurry, but it's an important differentiation. So what I have for you here are actually some of the drugs that we currently have right now that are cannabis-like products. We have 2 FDA-approved products that are on the market, dronabinol and nabilone. They're used commonly for nausea and vomiting. Somebody mentioned nausea over here related to chemotherapy. We have nabiximols or Sativex, which is in phase 3 trials. This is an oral mucosal spray that is a 50-50 mixture of THC, which we've all heard of, and CBD. How many of you have heard of CBD? Cannabidiol. It's another component of the plant. So it's an oral mucosal spray that says 50-50 mixture. It's primarily being used for muscle spasm related to MS and has that indication in over 25 countries. We also have Epidiolex, or cannabidiol, only. So that CBD by itself in an oral mucosal spray in investigational trials here in the US. It's being used primarily in those children with retractable epilepsy. We've heard some of these, Sanjay Gupta has done some things on this. They are having seizures despite trying a lot of different meds. And so it's called Dravet or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. What I'm really talking about today is the plant, marijuana. And this plant is pretty complex. It has a lot of cannabinoids in it. I've mentioned THC, I've mentioned CBD, but there's also CBN and CBC and CBG and all of these different cannabinoids. How many of you have been to Red Rocks? Ever smelled something at Red Rocks? Okay, those are the terpenes and the flavonoids in the plant, and we think that may have some benefit, and there's a lot more. For example, cannabis is a very lipophilic molecule. That means it likes the fat. It likes the brain, it likes our bodies. I may use marijuana today, have an effect for a few hours, but test positive days from now, because it's still in my system. Okay, so it's an interesting type of drug. Does anybody know, I'll just go by raise of hands here, the receptor that THC targets? How many of you would say CB1? CB7? PPAR? GPR 55? Okay, I have no idea. Okay, so we all have something to learn. The answer is actually CB1. Now, how many of you have heard of the endogenous cannabinoid system? A few of you. How many of you have heard of the central nervous system? Okay, you got that. Okay, good. We are good. That is where we are starting from, and that's perfect because the endogenous cannabinoid system runs just like the CNS from head to toe. Now, we don't know that much about it because it wasn't discovered until the 1990s. Okay? But this system running from head to toe operates like the CNS in that it's doing a lot of different things, metabolic processes, neurotransmitter processes, and the goal is homeostasis, meaning it wants to stay in balance. Much like the CNS, right? We have fight or flight. Similar thing here in the endocannabinoid system. Our body actually makes endocannabinoids called anandamide and 2-AG. Now, how many of you have heard of runner's high? What's that typically due to? What do we say that's due to? Endorphins. Probably not. It's actually anandamide, a molecule that our body produces to make us feel a little bit good. Okay? And when this anandamide or 2-AG attaches to receptors like the CB1 or CB2 receptors, it triggers a response. When an anandamide is targeting the brain, it stimulates a number of different effects. It may help, anandamide may help relieve our pain. It may help some of neurotransmitter release like dopamine or serotonin or norepinephrine. Most of us have heard of those. So we have this endocannabinoid system, and what you're seeing here is a picture of a synapse, really almost any synapse, and in the upper right, you've got anandamide and 2-AG. It's attaching to CB1, and it may release some sort of neurotransmitter. In this case, it might be something like dopamine, which is our reward chemical, okay? In our body, that feels good. We might like that. We have to ask the question, what happens if there were to be an endocannabinoid deficiency or destabilization or dysregulation? Let me ask you a couple questions. When people have depression, what is typically either dysregulated or deficient? Serotonin. When people have Parkinson's, what's dysregulated? Dopamine. When people have Alzheimer's, what's dysregulated or deficient? Acetylcholine. Could you then maybe agree with me that with an entire system in our body, there may be times when an endocannabinoid is deficient or dysregulated? And the way that we bring the body back into balance is with an exogenous cannabinoid. And when I say exogenous cannabinoid, what I am meaning is the plant cannabis. Are you with me? Okay, that's the aha moment. This is why. The anandamide looks like the THC, however, the THC is hundreds to thousands times more potent. So in a healthy person, when I use THC, instead of the runner's high that anandamide gives me, what does THC give me? Whee! It's 100 to thousands times more potent. But if I am a 2-year-old child with intractable epilepsy and I need to be brought back into homeostasis, that might just be what I need. Now, in that case, it's probably CBD and not THC, but are you appreciating where I'm going with this? It's the context of the medical and the recreational. As a recreational user, I'm already theoretically in balance, right? We're all a little maybe lopsided, right? But you can appreciate, and then in PTSD, an extreme case, not a mild depression or anxiety, but PTSD, where it's really prominent, it could be a problem, right? So we have different things and different areas that this cannabis can be affecting, and in some cases, medically, it could be good. Recreationally, it could be bad, right? For example, do people get hungry when they use marijuana? Yes. In the setting of cachexia, that's good. In the setting of the munchies at 2 a.m., that's bad, right? If we look at pain, same thing. Nausea and vomiting, it can help that. But if we do too much or we're a chronic user, we can have chronic or cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, where we go into cyclical vomiting. Movement. What happens to healthy people using marijuana? Dude. Right? I gave a talk today. I talked about people who are driving high. They stop at green lights. People who are drunk drive through red lights. Right? It's like the opposite. Things slow down. Our whole body slows down. But if I have a movement disorder, potentially that may help me gain balance. Are you with me? I hope that you're understanding why there's so much interest here. The other kid on the block is CBD. It's not a direct binding activity. It's probably indirect. And what it does is increase or suppress FAAH, which is the enzyme that breaks down anandamide. So by suppressing that, what are we doing to our anandamide? We're increasing it indirectly. Now, CBD has some other interesting effects. It actually looks to oppose THC at the receptor, so people don't get quite as high when they use a CBD-rich formulation. They have a high CBD concentration compared to THC. It does a lot of other things as well. The last one is as a GPR55 antagonist is somewhat interesting because GPR55 is needed for cells to mutate. If we antagonize that, where might that be helpful? Cancer. I'm not saying it's cure for cancer. I'm saying it's interesting in the animal modeling. Okay, so there's some things out there that are kind of interesting. So we have this endocannabinoid system that wants to be in balance in an exogenous cannabinoid that may help. But remember that that THC is very, very potent compared to what our body normally makes. Okay, and that's an important piece of it. So we have our synapse. This THC is like a sledgehammer. And because of that, there's a lot of different reasons that different states have taken different conditions for marijuana as qualifying conditions. Not all of them have good data. But there's a lot of different things. These are just two examples of Colorado and Connecticut. I know you all know there was an election on Tuesday, and I know you know who the president-elect is, but you may not know that 8 more states were brought on. 4 recreationally, and 4 with either new or expanded medical laws. So it's the tide has completely changed now where there's a majority of states with medical marijuana. And there's a lot of different potential effects. I mean, I've got such a short time. I could be here with you for hours to help you explain and understand it. But there's a lot of different potential effects in the body that could occur. But like every drug, there's a potential for adverse effects. So if we look at what the potential adverse effect might be here, what would you say? The common adverse effect, is it headache? No. Slowed reaction time? Yes. Decreased heart rate? No, it actually increases heart rate. Insomnia? No, it's sedating. Okay, and it's not all of the above, it is too. And when I talk to patients about this, I talk about 3 buckets: your heart, your lungs, and your brain. In your heart, it can increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and cause palpitations, especially with acute use. In the lungs, especially when smoked, it can cause coughing and wheezing, just like anything else we smoke. But I'm most concerned about your brain. And I'm especially concerned about a developing brain. I'll just leave it at that for now. But it makes it slow. It can impair memory. It can make you lethargic, and mostly, it can make you high. Right? Which gets you out of sorts. And for some people, that's a pleasurable effect. For some people, it's not pleasurable at all. And there are short-term effects. There are long-term effects of using this drug. Okay, so there's impaired motor coordination. There's psychosis, especially if we overdo it. People become very paranoid or very anxious if they take too much. In terms of long-term use, we know that there can be effects on a developing brain, and I cannot emphasize that enough at this point based on what we know. And we do know that there's an increased risk of psychosis disorders, like schizophrenia, for example. If kids or adults have a propensity to that, they are more likely to have schizophrenia earlier than they otherwise would have. Okay? There's a lot of different ways we can consume it: through the lungs, through the gut, and through the skin. How we use it depends on how long it acts, where it acts, and how long it takes for us to remove it from our system. And I'll just say for right now, the edibles scare me because we can overdo it very easily. So we do have an advisory committee in our state that's looking at these public health effects. I serve on this advisory committee in full disclosure, and we are doing systematic reviews of all of these different topics every 2 years. And it's readily available to all of you on the website. You can look at the articles, you can look at the impacts. It's very interesting. Of course, I have a real passion for the pregnancy and breastfeeding. So what am I going to say here in summary? I think there is a potential for cannabis in medicine. I really do. But I don't think we're there yet. The horse out of our barn is like across the ocean, right? We got to try to rein the horses back in a little bit from a nice pharmacist perspective. I'd like it to be a little bit more standardized. I'd like to understand it a little bit better. I think there are adverse effects that can and will occur with this drug, and so we have to be careful with that. And I want to end with just a couple patient cases so you can appreciate and understand the breadth of this conversation and how important it is. This is a 2-year-old, comes to Children's Hospital. All these tests are performed: urinalysis, CMP, CBC, Tylenol levels, aspirin levels, a urine tox, an EKG, a CT of the head, chest x-ray, because they didn't know what was wrong with him. Like, what's going on here, and should he be admitted? Well, it turned out he was admitted. He had an unintentional exposure to marijuana. And you know where he got it from? The babysitter. But it's not just the babysitter. It's the family, it's the child, it's everyone. Because it could have, in a lot of these cases, it's not the babysitter, it is the parent. Okay, now that conversation looks a little different than this one. Who is my 17-year-old who displays unusual behavior in the classroom? He's brought to the counselor's office. He verifies that the student was high, and he obtained gummy bears from a friend. He admitted to using cannabis several times. He claims it reduces his anxiety and anger, but he doesn't think it impacts his grades or his sports. How do I talk with him? Not the same as a 2-year-old, right? Here's another one. Pregnant mom, 27 years old, 2nd trimester. She's on a prenatal vitamin, no alcohol, no tobacco, but she smokes cannabis 1 to 2 times a day. And she started initially because she had nausea and vomiting of pregnancy, but now she's using it to reduce or improve her sleep. And I see it postpartum a lot to reduce anxiety. So I'll just say, this is not an unusual case for me. She heard about it having harm, but she doesn't really think the studies were done well enough, and she feels for her, the benefits outweigh any risk. How do I have this conversation? Lastly, 62-year-old female with long-standing diabetes and severe neuropathic pain. She's got other conditions, which we're all well aware of. She's used different over-the-counter medications. She's currently taking Tylenol, oxycodone, and pregabalin, which are all common medications for pain. She started vaping about 3 months ago, and she's using a bud that has this 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD. She's reduced her oxycodone now by 30% since starting cannabis. I'll just add an extra caveat. In our clinic, to use an illegal drug is not allowed by our narcotic contract. It's a policy issue. But now what conversation do I have with her? Are you with me? There's different aspects of health in this whole conversation. And so I think, and if I talk about is medication a means to health or not, I don't think it's health, it's a means to meaning. But it may help us in some cases feel better, and in some cases it may help us feel worse. So with that, I'll leave it to Matt to bring home the team, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please welcome Matt Roloff. Matt was part of the original team that conceived and developed the National Behavioral Health Innovation Center and is passionate about the opportunity to help support communities in building on their assets to help make Colorado the nation's leader in implementing new innovative solutions to long-standing behavioral health changes. Matt brings extensive leadership experience in public health replication and evaluation of evidence-based programs and behavioral health prevention, early intervention into this role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to start by just thanking David, Kevin, and Laura. It's pretty amazing to be on a panel with these three. And normally batting cleanup is a good thing, but not when you have to go after three people like that. So I think I know how Brian Greasy felt when he had to replace John Elway. So just go a little bit easy on me now that we've set the bar so high. And I mostly want to thank all of you. You know, this is a pretty cool day for me. I started the day by giving a talk at the Sutherland Center for bipolar treatment up in Boulder. And then finishing with this, and I really am having the same feeling on both of them, which is just a lot of hope. When I see a sellout crowd in both of those venues of people who came out to spend time that they could have been spending any number of different ways. I mean, Thursday night's a great TV night, but for you to come out and choose to come and listen and struggle with a really hard subject to talk about mental health, it gives me a lot of hope in a week where, frankly, we need it. So thank you very, very much for that. I'm just going to briefly, in the next 30 minutes or so, I want to talk and give you a very, very brief overview of the status of mental health in Colorado and the United States. And I'm just going to highlight some, actually lowlight some of the key things. And it's going to make you mad, and it's supposed to. David's going to have to come back up and do his meditation all over again because we're going to completely ruin it. But then we're going to talk about what we think some of the root problems are. We're not going to have time to get into all of them. I'll talk a little bit about my own experience, and then we're going to try to end on a little bit more of a hopeful note and talk about where we're going and what we can do going forward. That's hopefully going to change the direction that things are going. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the issue right now, there's about 19 million Americans that suffer from depression, about 6 million that have bipolar disorder, and about 58 million with an anxiety disorder. And the numbers are a little bit misleading because oftentimes these things co-occur, and so there's overlap. And the anxiety disorders, that number is so high because it includes a whole wide range of different things. So everything from panic disorders to obsessive compulsive, PTSD, and then on down to simple phobias, things like fear of spiders or fear of the next 4 years. Sorry, I told myself I wasn't going to go there, and I did. I won't anymore. This is really, really bad news. This is the slide that, the phrase, read it and weep, really applies here. That about a quarter of the population in the United States will experience a mental illness at least once in their lifetime, but 80% of them, 80% will get inadequate care, or no care at all. This is not a new fact. We've known this for a while. This has been around for a while, and yet we accept it because we have different standards that we hold ourselves to and we hold our systems to for how we take care of ourselves mentally versus how we take care of ourselves physically. If we had had a slide that said 80% of people with cancer get inadequate care or no care at all, there would be riots in the street. It would be the front page of the New York Times every day. There'd be a special hearing in Congress to do something about it. But we just accept it as fact that this is what people with mental illness deserve and are worth. There's another cheery slide. Basically what you see here, this is from 2013, and it's the percentage of adults that have mental illness not receiving treatment. So it's a very similar slide, but the point that's being made here is that we are one of the worst states. And you know, we think of Colorado as this great place to live, and there's all these opportunities for recreation, and we have all the sunshine that we're always bragging about and the fresh air, and yet, when it comes to mental illness, we're not doing a very good job of taking care of ourselves at all. Another cheery one, when you look at the distribution of where the providers are located in this state, not only is there a shortage of mental health providers here like there is just about everywhere in the United States, but they're not evenly distributed. So the vast majority of the psychiatrists, the child psychologists, and other areas, you know, that aren't even on the side, like, you know, geriatric psychiatrists, and most of these substance use disorder providers, they're all located either in Denver or Colorado Springs. So if you happen to be living in Grand Junction, you're pretty well hosed if you develop a condition. We're in the bottom third for spending on public mental health and for inpatient psychiatric bed capacity. In some recent years, you know, the numbers changed and our ranking changes a little bit, but just 2 years ago, we were dead last for psychiatric inpatient bed capacity. So that means if you were suicidal and you needed to be put on a mental health hold, you had a better chance of getting a bed in a poor southern state like Louisiana or Mississippi than you do right here in Colorado. That should make you mad. And when you drill down even further, it's even more aggravating. I mean, let's, you know, call out the elephant in the room. It's unconscionable that we don't have an adult inpatient unit here on this campus. We need to change that. Thank you. We also, the reality is that, you know, on the Western Slope, there's only one inpatient unit on the entire Western Slope. That's in Grand Junction. If you live in Telluride or Aspen and you become suicidal, here's hoping there's not a blizzard, because even if you can get a bed, which most of the time you can't, you're probably going to have an impossible time getting there. And what very often happens, and there was legislation that almost got enacted this year, and thank God the governor vetoed it, that was going to make it legal to take people who were waiting for a bed on a mental health hold and to hold them in a jail. The governor vetoed it, but it had broad bipartisan support. And even though that hasn't passed, even though it's illegal, it happens all the time. We did some work up in Pitkin County, and the head of the jail there was telling us that all the time. The hospital will do the screen and say, well, we don't have a psychiatrist, so we can't do anything with them. So they drop them off at the county jail, and they put them into a holding cell and hold them there until they can get a bed. And he made a brilliant, brilliant point. He said, if everybody in a small town knows that if you ask for help when you're suicidal, they're going to take you to jail, why in the world would anybody ever ask for help? They wouldn't. They won't. And so what does it ultimately lead to? Well, the ultimate bad outcome with any untreated mental illness that we're the most concerned about, obviously, is suicide. And I'll give you a couple of facts about suicide in the United States right now. The United States is at a 30-year high with our suicide rate. Last year, 42,000, just over 42,000 people died by suicide. In Colorado, we've crossed the 1,000 suicide mark for the 4th year in a row, and we're at the highest rate that Colorado has been in 28 years. In Colorado, more people die every year by suicide than by motor vehicle accidents and homicides combined, and yet, what do you see when you drive down the highway? You see billboards. No texting while you drive. Click it or ticket, don't drink and drive. We have public service announcements. We make our kids go to school. We have all kinds of legislation about safe driving. And yet what's really killing people is suicide, and it's not getting nearly the attention that it should. There's a very, very disturbing impact and some disturbing trends that we're seeing with respect to suicide among women. Over the last 15 years, the suicide rate among women 45 to 64 has increased 63%. In the same period for Native American women, it's gone up 89%. And in the same period, the rate for adolescent girls aged 10 to 14, still a small number, but the rate among 10 to 14-year-old young girls has tripled in the last 15 years. Now you look at this map, and basically, without getting into all the detail, pretty much what you're looking at here is the dark states are the ones with the very highest suicide rates. In any given year, Colorado tends to fluctuate between 6 and 8 for the most part. We've been there for about the last 20 years, somewhere in the top 10, usually around 68. So what do you notice about this map? Western states, Western mountain states. Why do you think that is? What's going on here? What's that? Guns, thank you. Yeah, usually people forget that until the end. You're a smart crowd. The vast majority, about 60% of all suicides are at the hands of a firearm. And so when you look at a map of gun ownership rates, it looks an awful lot like this map too. Now there's some notable exceptions like our friends down in Texas, but they put a lot more money into public mental health than we do in Colorado. There's other reasons though. What do you think some of those are? Lack of services, yeah, it goes back to we don't spend money on public mental health. What else? A lot of rural areas, which plays out in a couple of different ways. One is it means that people have to drive a long way just to get to a primary care doc or a therapist, or God forbid they have to see a psychiatrist. Remember the earlier slide that most of them are in Denver or the Colorado Springs. I was just up in New Hampshire for a few days earlier in the week, and they were talking about these vast rural distances that people have to drive to get to. Well, you can drive from the top of New Hampshire down to the bottom, and you're not even getting a fraction of the distance that some of the people in our state would have to travel, sometimes over several mountain passes, to be able to access care. The other thing about the small rural towns is stigma. And stigma is huge in the West, and especially these small towns. So that even if you do have a community mental health center that's there, everybody in town knows your truck. And people will say, I'm not going to go park there, because then people will know that I'm at the mental health facility, and they don't go there. And then we have this, they call it the frontier mentality. We're in the West, we're rugged, we're supposed to be cowboys, and we're ice climbers and rock climbers. I mean, not me, but other people are, mountain bikers, and so we're tough, and we're not supposed to ask for help. It's not something that's really valued out here. So I know a lot about what I'm talking about, both professionally but also personally. And I want to mention just briefly my own experience, very briefly. It's important though, because I've gained some insight on the mental health system and what's wrong with it, because I've lived through my own experience of depression. My story really begins about 14 years ago when my son was about 6 months old, and I was in the throes of one of the worst depressive episodes that I've ever had, and I had not ever received treatment or been to a doctor for it. And things got so bad, as they often do with depression. They would, it would go away, it would come back, it would go away, it come back. But every time it comes back a little bit deeper and a little bit darker and a little bit stronger. And eventually I just got to a point where I had lost all hope, and I was in so much pain that I thought the only way to deal with this is to take my own life. So I went to a gun store and I bought a revolver with the intent of killing myself at the end of that week. And the thing is with suicide isn't about death. That's not the intent of suicide. Suicide's about pain relief. But you get so hopeless and your thinking gets so distorted that you don't see any other way out of it. So I decided that I was going to kill myself at the end of the week, and I wrote a note. I picked a place, I picked the date. And thank God, after I dropped my son off at the nanny and said goodbye to him for what I assumed was the last time, I went back home, and a neighbor of mine, Lucille, who had been trained in suicide prevention, gatekeeper training, saw me crying, and she recognized that something was wrong, and she convinced me to trade the gun for treatment, and I decided to get care. Now, normally you would say that was the rock bottom moment, right? I mean, you're about to kill yourself. It doesn't get worse than that. But it did, because then I had to confront the hell that is the mental health system in this country. And things get worse before they get better, believe me. As anybody in here knows who has tried to access care at some point in time, you know that, well, the first thing you do is you call the insurance company, right? Well, good luck getting a call back. You know, you've got the big number on the back of your insurance card for the physical stuff, and then that little behavioral health number, yeah, it doesn't go to anything. It's just a phone in a room that just rings. So I go online and I find a list of providers and I start calling them. They don't call back. And I'm more and more persistent, and I call and I call and I call. Well, finally, some of them actually did start to call me back. And what do you hear? Oh, sorry, we're not taking new patients right now. The practice is closed. We have a 6-month wait list. We don't take insurance anymore. We actually just take cash. We're out of business. He moved out of state, or in one case, he's no longer alive. I kid you not. Then when you finally do find an opening, oftentimes you discover that some of the people that have openings for a reason. The best folks don't have openings, I'll just say that. So I went through a period where I was misdiagnosed and given the wrong medications and given things that actually made my condition worse, not better. And even had one guy fall asleep on me, which makes you feel really good when you have bad self-esteem, to see your psychiatrist fall asleep, let me tell you. And then you also realize that even when you do establish good care, it's totally uncoordinated. You know, you've got a primary care doctor involved, and you have a therapist, and you've got a psychiatrist doing your meds, and they don't talk to each other. In many cases, you know, when you have to go out of network, they're not on the same electronic health record. They don't even know that even if you sign the forms, it doesn't matter. They don't interact with one another. So you're having to retell what's going on, and you know, each person has a fraction of information that would be really, really useful for the other ones to know, but they don't. And then the last thing is, of course, stigma. And there's so much stigma with mental health. What actually happened with me was that I got referred to a psychiatrist, and I finally decided I'm just going to pay out of pocket. And so I got an appointment with the help of a friend here on campus with someone who was very good in the community, and she was very expensive, so I just had to put it all on a credit card. And when she finally diagnosed me, I got probably the worst news I ever could have heard. And when she said, "You actually don't have depression, you have type 2 bipolar disorder." Now, talk about a slap in the face. I know it sounds crazy, but at that moment, if she had told me I had cancer, it would have been easier to hear. Because bipolar, it felt like a death sentence too, but it also carried with it all the stuff that stigma brings. It brings shame. Cancer doesn't have shame. There's no shame in it, but bipolar, there's something wrong with me. I'm gonna be the crazy guy. I'm gonna be the nut that's sitting by himself down at the end of the bleachers at my kid's game because nobody wants to be near me, and my kids don't wanna be near me because they're afraid of me. And I lived with that for years, and bipolar was my most carefully guarded secret, and nobody outside of my family knew that I had it. So all of these things are fundamental problems in the system, and if we're ever going to make any changes and any improvements, we have to address those things. So what are the problems? I'm gonna highlight just 3 of them, and we've talked about it a little bit, but the first one, I had a neighbor who was a foreign exchange student, or they had a foreign exchange student from Japan, and I was talking with him one day, and I said, you know, what are you noticing about, you know, the United States that's different from Japan? And he said, well, you guys fix cars really weird here. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, you know, in Japan, we just go to a mechanic, but you guys have one place for wheels and one place for axles and one place for brakes and one place for tires and one place for oil and one place for transmissions, but they all work together. Why do you do that? And it hit me. I'm like, wow, you just like completely summed up our healthcare system. The only notable difference is that we do a whole lot better job of taking care of our cars than we do at taking care of our heads. I mean, we bring our cars in for regular oil changes and rotate the tires and do all the stuff we're supposed to do, but we don't take care of our mental health. The other problem is gout. The other problem is actually stigma. I put the gout slide up because there was a story that was really profound for me. It happened about a year ago. And I was going for a meeting in Cherry Creek with a funder over there. And I was in the lobby of the building, and I was standing with another guy who was in a suit, and a maintenance guy comes walking up to him, and it was clear that they knew each other. And the one guy said, hey, you know, whatever his name was, maintenance guy, you know, how have you been? I haven't seen you in a while. And he said, oh, I was out. I had a really bad case of gout, and I had to miss a couple weeks of work. And the guy in the suit said, oh, I feel your pain. My brother went through that. It was awful. He's had it come back a couple of times. And he said, did they put you on meds? Yeah, what did they put you on? And they were going back and forth. And he said, oh, my brother had a book. I'll get that for you on the diet. And we were in the elevator at this point, and it's like I was completely invisible. And they're just talking about gout. And one guy's listening and being supportive and offering ideas. And I got off on my floor, and I was like, that's it. That's what it looks like. Can you imagine a day when two people in front of a total stranger would say, where were you? Oh, you know what? I have bipolar disorder, and I hit a depressive skid, and I had to go in and get a 72-hour hold. Oh, really? My brother had that. What medication are you on? This is what he's on. I have a book, and just do that and talk that freely where you don't have to look over your shoulder and see if anybody's listening. That's what we want. There's one other story I'll tell. I worked at the Depression Center until just recently, and I had met with a donor there who came in and he said, he was going to give a $10,000 donation to sponsor the luncheon. And he said, but here's the thing, you have the worst name of any organization on the planet, and I'll double our investment. He was the CEO of a pretty big company. And he said, I'll double our gift if you agree to change your name. And he said, I'll make my marketing department available to you free of charge to come up with a new brand and a logo and name and everything else. And I said, if we were at the Cancer Center, would we be having this conversation? If we were the Heart Center or the Diabetes Center, why is it that we can say diabetes out loud, but we can't even say the word depression? Why is it that it's so horrible that it's worth $20,000 to not say it? It's crazy. The other problem is that our system is clogged. There's not enough lanes on the highway. The bottom line is, we can talk about things like telehealth or other solutions, but at the end of the day, we have more sick people than we have doctors and nurses and therapists to be able to take care of them. And it's not going to change. We can't just keep focusing on taking care of sick people. We have to move stuff upstream, and I'll talk about that right now. I want to talk just briefly about 4 ways out. And things that I think that we can do. We can't just focus on waiting till people are really sick and then saying, oh, how are we going to take care of them? Look at my own experience. It does not work. And my experience is unfortunately not unique at all. It's very, very common for most people. So we have to move it upstream, and that means doing a lot more work in the areas of prevention and early intervention. We don't always think about prevention with mental health or mental illness, but there's a lot that we can do. For example, workplace wellness programs. There's a great group here on campus headed by Lee Newman that looks at total worker health. And they're saying, well, we have all these employer-based wellness programs, but most of them are just physical wellness. And we put out fresh fruit and give them a Fitbit, but we don't pay attention to the mental stuff that's going on. We ignore the fact that many people who are obese are not obese because they're too lazy to exercise or they don't know about vegetables. They do, but maybe they have depression and they're eating as an emotional coping mechanism. Maybe it's that they're depressed, and so if you've had depression, you know that it's nearly impossible just to get out of bed in the morning, much less to go to the gym and work out. So we have to pay attention to those things. And then there's another company, Johns Manville here in town. I'll give them a shout out. They are a company that approached us and said, we want to become the model for how companies deal with their employees' mental health, not just the physical health. They're even looking at putting mental health as a component into their manufacturing plant safety plan, because they understand that the people who are getting hurt on the machines are the people who are depressed and anxious, because your mind isn't there. You're wandering, you're thinking about other things. Your reaction times are slower, and they're the ones that are losing fingers on the machine. So progressive companies like that are just a godsend, and it's great to be able to work with them. The second thing that we need to do is we've got to innovate. We need to bring bold, new, different ideas to the field of mental health rather than just doing the same things over and over again. There's that famous Einstein quote where he said, we're never going to be able to solve problems using the same line of thinking that we used to create them. But that's what we do in mental health all too often. This is a picture from one of my favorite movie scenes in Apollo 13, where the guy comes in and he said, we have to make this fit into the hole for this using nothing but this, and they dump out everything that they had in the spaceship. And he said, the idea is that we can wish that we had more. We can wish that we had more psychiatrists, but we don't. We can wish that we have more therapists and inpatient beds, but we don't. And until we do, we have to find other ways to address these problems. And so there's, I'll give you examples of some programs here. There's a suicide initiative, suicide prevention initiative out of New Hampshire called the New Hampshire Gun Shop Project. And it's actually a partnership between the gun industry and gun shops and the suicide prevention world. Well, that's never happened. These are longtime adversaries. But people there recognize that a lot of times people are buying guns in crisis. And so they said, well, can we reframe this as a gun safety issue so that they're distributing suicide prevention materials at the gun shop? What a great concept. And it's been successful. So we're now doing an adaptation of that with the Department of Defense for use around military bases because we know that the majority of US military suicides right now are same-day off-base gun purchases. Because most bases you can't have a personal firearm. So they go off base, they buy it when they're suicidal and in crisis, and then take their life that day. So we see a tremendous opportunity, and we're working with them on that. We have to expand the workforce, which means that everybody's involved. Doctors, nurses, and therapists can't solve these problems alone. We have to involve business leaders. We have to involve journalists and teachers and everybody else, including all of you, so you're not off the hook, in helping us solve these problems. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment in just a moment. And then finally, the last thing we need to do as a university is we need to start listening. And universities don't do a great job of listening. This is a desire line. Anybody know what desire lines are? All right, you've seen these though, the dirt paths that go across college campuses. Well, what a desire line is when they, the campuses, they build a new building, and the architects with all their fancy modeling software and all their wisdom of how humans interact with the built environment, they say we know exactly where the sidewalk should go, and inevitably they're wrong, and the people who actually work there and interact there show them that they're wrong and make these dirt paths. Well, what some smart universities like Texas or University of Virginia and Michigan State have started doing is that whenever they build a new building, they don't put in sidewalks for 6 months. They say, we're going to let the people tell us where the sidewalks go. What a concept, right? And then they come in, and wherever there's dirt, they put in a sidewalk, and it's just that simple. Well, we need to do that as universities. Too often we approach communities and say, oh, we have this great idea, and we know exactly what you need and exactly what your problem is, and we're going to come in, and we have a 3-year grant, and we're going to implement it and study it, and we're going to publish papers, and I'm going to make professor on it, and then, good luck to you when it's all done. We got to change that. It needs to start with, what do you need? What are the problems that you're struggling with? And that's going to help us drive innovation into new solutions. And I'll give one quick example of that. We're working with cops and firefighters, and people have done a lot with respect to their struggles around mental health. Well, one of the things that they told us is the chief said, nobody pays attention to us. Everybody forgets about the chiefs and the leadership, and we're in total isolation. We have no peers. We can't be part of the peer support program, and we're dying out here. And so we went and we found a company that built an app for chief information officers of different companies to be able to communicate confidentially with one another around issues like data security and stuff that companies have a vested interest in sharing information on. And we said, well, what if we were to adapt this for use with the chiefs? And so we brought it back to them, and they said, that's it, that's what we want. So now that company that built the app is going to work with us on helping us to develop that adaptation of the app. So here's your homework assignment. I'd like everybody to take out your cell phones right now and turn them on, even though you've been instructed not to. I want you to turn it on. And I'd like you to program that number, Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners, into it. They also are the call center for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in Colorado. They are 24/7 master's level therapists. You can call them anytime for any reason. It's free, totally confidential. You can call for yourself or for someone else if you even just need help finding a therapist. It's really important to have this number at your fingertips. And if you have to try to remember what was the name of the place or Google it, you're going to have a harder chance of finding it. So I ask people to put this on their phone whenever they talk, and then I also ask a commitment that within a week you'll get this on the phone of 5 friends or family members. I think ultimately someday I hope the cell phone companies start to put some of these numbers on there. And then my cell phone number is there. And if you have ideas, there's also a card in your folder where you can write ideas. You don't prank me. I know my refrigerator's running, but if you have ideas of of innovation and new things that we can try in mental health, send them to me. We want to know. And then before the end of the night, do something for you. Just one little thing, even if it's just doing a breathing exercise on your way to the car, and do one thing for someone else. If there's a friend that you've been worried about, just call them or send them a text before you go to bed and ask. These little things are incredibly important. And I'll just end with this. You know, in this week where there's been so much anger and frustration on so many people's parts, I was thinking a lot about Dr. Seuss and how the Grinch Stole Christmas. And if you remember the very last scene, all the Who's in Whoville wake up and they discover that all their gifts and their decorations and food have been stolen. And they didn't react with anger. They didn't shout. They didn't protest. They didn't kick things or cry. They joined hands and they started singing. And the Grinch heard it from afar, and he realized that he had lost because you can't steal something from someone that lives in their heart. And so I think that if we can do these little things for people that are upset this week, this is our way of singing. This is our way of sort of taking this week back. So please, before you go to bed tonight, do something nice for yourself and for at least one other person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, David Stevens, Kevin, Laura, and Matt. This is outstanding. We're going to start the Let's Talk part of conversations about women's health. So if this is an opportunity for you to ask a question to our panel of experts. Some of you have a microphone attached to your seat. If you're going to ask a question, hold the microphone down. We have a roving mic, and if you don't want to ask a question and would prefer to write it, we'll read it. I will get started with some questions that were already submitted. But really, Matt, I don't think you've explained what the National Behavioral Health Innovation Center is, so maybe start with that.
Sure. I'll give the short version.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have to
Okay.
hold it.
When the red light's on, that means you're gone.
Okay, great. This center it's a brand new idea, and the idea is to listen to communities and to help them find solutions to mental health and addiction problems that they're struggling with. We don't actually implement or we don't run programs. We help our community partners, whether that's a nonprofit or another campus, department on another campus in the CU system, to set up programs, get an evaluation structure in place, help them figure out sustainable funding for it. And then once it's up and running, we move on to the next thing. So we have about 12 different active projects right now in a lot of different areas. But the idea is just to try to drive big ideas into the field of mental health and hopefully move things along more quickly than we have in the past.
Thank you. Okay. Question. I wake at 2 a.m. and curious to know how to combat this. The lack of sleep wreaks havoc on my entire body and impacts my ability to be productive and energetic. Who would like to take the question?
Well, Laura just said you should smoke pot. So she just whispered it. You didn't hear her, but she said it. I'm not a sleep expert, but, and so, at the risk of, sounding like a TV commercial, it is something you should talk to your doctor about. But, there's a lot of approaches to sleep hygiene. And, I think the biggest thing is, most mental health clinicians can give you very concrete ideas on this. But the biggest thing is to figure out what's the root cause of it. I will say that, from my own experience, staying away from any sort of screen for about an hour before you go to bed has made all the difference in the world for my sleep. One of my doctors told me that flat panel screens emit a spectrum of light that's a lot closer to daylight than old tube TVs. So it really wreaks havoc with your brain and thinking that there's sun out there.
Also, if you're into using apps, there's a really nice app that the Veterans Administration developed. It's called, I was speaking about smartphone apps, and we've been looking into that a lot lately with some of the work we're doing. The Veterans Administration developed one that's called CBTI, Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Insomnia. CBTI turns out to be currently the best treatment for insomnia. And this app is really a high quality app. You don't need to doesn't cost you anything. You don't need to be a veteran. You can just search for it and find it online and or on your phone, and it could be helpful. And I also know that there are some real national reputation sleep experts, Jack Ettinger and his crew at National Jewish, if somebody wanted to go there.
And I have it's kind of a meditative technique. I was always fascinated by the fact that despite the blue light, I often nod off while watching television, yet when I go to bed, I'm wide awake. So I was doing some research, and I found there's this technique where you just get yourself comfortable in bed, so comfortable that you don't really need to move, and then just keep your eyes open as if you were watching something, and just have the intention of keeping your eyes open, have the intention of staying awake no matter what. And the same thing will start to happen. Your eyelids will get heavy, and it's helped me in the past, so you might want to try that.
Okay, how does one distinguish the early signs of mental illness from normal teenage behavior? Altered sleep patterns, irritability, bursts of anger, mood swings. Which could lead into another one of the questions: how do we help friends and family who we know are suffering and get them help? Thank you.
I'm just going to say something more from the family medicine perspective, where we do see a lot of adolescents in the real importance of screening. And in our clinic, every person is screened, no matter what they are seen for. And it's a very quick two-question question that comes along with your, how much pain are you in, and how are you feeling, and that kind of a thing. But I think that is a start. And we have a lot of adolescents who are going in for annual physicals. We talk about diagnosing early. I think that is one way that can be very helpful, and the screening piece is really important.
I'm going to add to that, the University of Colorado Hospital is embedding this screening in all of the primary care practices. Elizabeth Benoit is here. There she is. Working on getting grants for our primary care practice so that mental health is available on site. Press and hold. Press and hold, it should work.
Working? Okay. Appreciate tonight's speakers. I'm actually don't work on the campus. I'm a patient. And since this is not a biased room for mental health, I will be frank. I had never had any kind of mental illness till I had my third child, and was kicked in the face with postpartum depression, where my life was very shattered. I had 3 attempts during the throes of it, and another attempt just 16 months ago with a pretty heavy-duty hospitalization. And I guess one of the things that happens in depression is the self-loathing, and how when I was going through it, through the deepest parts of it, was I kept telling my doctor, I just want to be, I just want to be, I just want to feel like it's okay to exist. Because the self-loathing was so intense that it was not okay to exist. The mere existence of my organism was a bane. And so when we talk about, Mr. Masters was talking about live like you mean it, where does a patient start that when you have such loathing for yourself, even 7 years postpartum? And you know you want it, but it's hard to even approach the subject because you hate it so much. And then when you said something about find a purpose by finding a cause, something to work for, I knew what that cause was when I was in the throes of it, and it was to inform or educate other patients on what I was going through. And I kept telling my doctor, we need to write a book about this. We need to do something about this. We need to do something about this. And I think she thought I was crazy. And it's still there. So I still want to make that happen, but I don't have a master's or a PhD in any of this. I'm just the one who experienced it. How can I get involved?
Okay. Well, that's a complicated question, really. And I mean, obviously, I think, there's different levels of being able to seek a purpose or a cause. In that one slide, I talked about they can be large, they can be small. And for many people, starting small is a good way to go. Some of these interesting studies that have been done in nursing homes, where essentially nursing homes have become these sort of institutions for housing people and making sure they stay safe. So don't let them walk because they might fall down. So put them in a wheelchair. And the institutions exist to serve the institution. So everybody eats at the same time rather than the individual. And it becomes so some interesting work's been done where they've given these individuals just some small amount of responsibility or purpose or something else that's dependent on them. In one study, it was birds, just birds. And the people thought they were crazy when they first brought these birds in. What are we going to do with birds? And it turned out that when people had to take care of a bird, and I don't know what you do with birds, but whatever you do with birds, they took care of their birds, and then they started talking to their birds. But they weren't crazy talking to their birds. They were developing a relationship with these birds, and there was a reason for them to get up in the morning that was something other than being wheeled out to the TV room. And so I guess the point being that it doesn't have to be huge. There are ways to start small in developing a purpose. And you may not start small, makes it sound like it has to go huge. I'm not sure that it ever has to go huge, depending on the person and the circumstances. The other thing, though, I'd say about the book, I'm not sure that having a master's degree or a PhD necessarily means you have the best talent to write the book on this. I think Matt was talking about his own experience tonight, and that experience isn't dependent on education. That experience is the experience that he's had. I think your experience is clearly a valuable one. And publishing can be difficult, but the internet has opened up the world in terms of blogs, and people can get access now in so many ways that before you couldn't, when you had to go through a publishing house and get a publishing agent and all those sorts of things. So I think there's a lot of possibilities, in those directions. But it also, to be honest, sounds like, getting some personal help and treatment and so forth would also be, a positive thing that would be beyond what we could do in this setting tonight.
Thank you. Another question. Being a provider and the current financial pressures on practice, this high level of stress has led to much drinking to the point that I feel dependent on daily drinking. I have several other colleagues that are exactly the same way, really need help, but also ways to deal with this level of stress. Some questions are difficult to answer.
I'm not sure I'm going to have an answer because I think what I want to be able to say is it's not just alcohol. From my lens, it's much more than just alcohol. And I've talked about cannabis, I've talked about opioids, but it's not that. Sometimes it's the sleep drug. It's the drug that helps you sleep. It's the drug that helps you stay awake. It's all of these things. And I think what David Stevens brought for us tonight is a good reminder of how we can try to break free of some of that stress. And I believe, now this is not my pharmacy training, this is Laura training, which is it comes from within us. And to reach within us in that peaceful place, and to do our best to not allow that stress. And that's a lot of what David reminded me of tonight in that exercise was that bubble is still holding a lot of garbage I had from today and last year and the year before that. And when I walk out that door, that bubble's gonna pop all over me. But it's been nice to be in a place where you can put that in a bubble. And I think that when we talk about stress, and I meant this today when I said the medications may help, but they may not. And I think a lot of it comes from within our own being. And having cues like what you're describing and what David did for us tonight is a good reminder that that's where we need to be reaching.
David, do you want to add?
Yeah, part of the first thing we did, I said it was a mindfulness thing. So that was just the connecting to the earth, and that helps us be more present in our body. And then we just breathe, because from what I understand, and I feel a little intimidated because there's so much knowledge here, but the suppression of our breath, I find often goes with suppression of emotions. So both those things can help a lot with stress. And then whenever I have a problem, and my wife will attest to this, I look, I research, I do everything I can to help myself with it. And there's just so many things that can lessen your stress. That meditation I talked about, that little walking meditation, and just walking itself often lessens stress. So it might not be that one thing solves it, but some seated meditation solves it, some walking meditation solves it, and then exploring other therapies and things that can help. And if this one helps 5% and this one helps 10% and this one helps 15%, then pretty soon you're over the point, you're over the hump where the problem's dominating your life. So, and the other thing about mindfulness too is we learn that it's really up to us. We talk about stress, but stress is just our reaction. People have talked about the election, and several of my friends posted that I really love my pets because they're blissfully unaware of what's going on. And we are the ones who assign significance to things. We are the ones who assign meaning to things. And then we can also, through meditation and other practices, learn to decrease that, learn to make things less significant. Thank you.
Does anyone want to ask a question? Yes, go ahead. Press and hold.
I actually don't have a question. I have two comments. One for Mr. Masters and one for, I'm sorry I didn't get your name. Gayleen. First for Gayleen, thank you for sharing your experience. I'm an inpatient nurse at the University of Colorado Hospital, and you asked a question, if I think I got it correctly. How do you add meaning to your life with the experience that you've had? And I work on the oncology bone marrow transplant unit, and granted, I don't work in OB or labor and delivery. But I can tell you that regardless of your health experience or your experience as an inpatient, you are not the only one who's ever dealt with this kind of challenge. And I think in a very strange way, it's almost a gift to a degree, because you just said, how do I share my experience with other people? How do I help other people? And I don't know you, so I don't know if this is a good idea, if this fits your character, your personality. But I can tell you that I've seen a lot of patients who've dealt with similar challenges that you have. And once they've gotten to significant milestones where they've gotten help and they've gotten counseling and they get to that point and that juncture where they do want to give back, they've come into our hospital and they volunteered. And it's challenging for those patients who are in that spot at that moment, and they're inpatient, either dealing with a cancer diagnosis or dealing with postpartum depression or dealing with, and there's no one to talk to. So you might want to consider that further down the road, that if you get to a place where you're like, okay, I'm ready and I want to give back and I want to share this special gift that I now have, even though it was a very long road to get there, you might want to consider something like that. It might help you add meaning. And we would love to have you, because we're always looking for very passionate volunteers. Well, we would love to have you, because as nurses, one of the frustrating things for us is that we don't have enough time in a day to do everything that we want to do for our patients. We do a tremendous amount, but sometimes just being able to sit with them and talk to them about what they're experiencing emotionally is something that we don't get to do often enough, and we want to. And that's where our volunteers really, really add a lot to the experience, because even if they're just coming and watching movies or reading books, it's really helpful. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else have a question they'd like to ask or a piece of paper they'd like to bring down?
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Okay, well, start here.
I wanted to ask, apart from military, when do you diagnose someone with PTSD?
Sorry, can you repeat that? When do you diagnose someone? You know, I think I'm not a psychiatrist. In our clinic, it takes many different forms. It can be one traumatic event, a car accident, a sexual assault, there are a lot of different shapes that PTSD can take for a variety of reasons. I think the VA, that it's highlighted in the VA because of our veterans, but it is an illness that occurs for a lot of different reasons and is diagnosed, again, in very many different types of places.
Also for the pharmacist. I had one on cannabis, marijuana. Just on the left side of one of your slides, it says the cannabidiol naturally inhibits some sort of THC binding, maybe like an antagonization. And I was just wondering how much, clearly just a surface explanation, how much that is natural, and because that would, counter the THC naturally, and then maybe how much that they design into some of the CBD.
So I'll just say, since the 70s, we nearly bred out CBD because we were trying to maximize our THC for psychoactive reasons. In the last 10 to 15 years, there's been many more plants that have been bred to try to create ratios of these various cannabinoids. And we are finding that there are probably ratios that are better for some conditions than others. So, for example, a balanced THC to CBD ratio may be more, and I'll just say, and CBN may be helpful for something like insomnia. But there's no study to show that. What I talked about actually earlier today was a few studies on neuropathic pain, some studies on epilepsy. We have a few in migraine, some in GI disorders. But many of those studies, outside of the approved products, they are not standardized doses with standardized strains. So a lot of what we are doing now is really gathering what is observational data based on what patients are using and establishing some dosing that way, but it's very sloppy.
So it's probably a natural desired kind of counter effect that balances how much is bound and how much is binding to receptors and stuff. So
yes, and every person's response will be different as well. So the CBD does seem to oppose the THC from getting a high standpoint, but it all depends on the strain and the person. There's two different factors that have a very strong interplay there. And my response to cannabis would likely be different than your response. And even my response to cannabis today could be very different to my cannabis response tomorrow.
Given that there are enormous problems with mental health, it's a hugely prevalent condition. Is there a move at our hospital to get some psych beds, to get a place where patients can come?
If I have anything to say about it. Yeah, I know that I will say that this is an issue that is of grave concern to President Bruce Benson. I have heard him speak 3 or 4 times in the last few months, and he's bringing it up every time. And he's talking about mental health being one of the top priorities. Chancellor Elliman on this campus gave his state of the campus address and outlined the priorities going forward, and mental health was the third one that he mentioned. That's never happened on this campus before, where we've held up mental health as a top priority for that. We also have a new chair coming in for the Department of Psychiatry. They're just starting to do that search because Dr. Friedman retired. So I think that there's a number of forces that are gathering, and I really believe that it is going to happen sooner than later, and if for no other reason than to just shut me up about it. But.
Okay, to add to that, there is a question here about providers at UC Anschutz, so you've addressed that we're coming there, but we're not there yet. Primary care is working to embed screening in all of our primary care practices. Is it common for someone to be unaware they're slipping into a depression until it feels too late? What symptoms should we watch out for, and how should we respond when we see them? And I'm going to add another question to that. Is the goal of antidepressants to eventually be able to stop taking them, or is it forever? Is depression a normal part of post-menopausal life?
Well, I'll take the first part of the question, and we'll let our drug expert take the second part. Depression can sneak on, and you can be in the middle of it before you know that it's even coming your way. And one of the telltale signs that people will often notice in advance of any sort of feeling of dysphoria or sadness or down in the dumps is sleep difficulty, and in particular, what they used to call terminal insomnia, which is you can go to sleep and you can sleep reasonably well till maybe, say, 4 o'clock in the morning. And then you wake up consistently and you can't get back to sleep, and then you start the whole sleep problem. And that's one of those signs. I'm not in clinical practice anymore, but back in the day when I would always ask people about their sleep, in part because if they don't sleep better, they're not going to get better. But also because in some cases it would be the telltale sign that there was something else going on or coming on that they weren't necessarily aware of. So that's one for sure that I often advise people to, if you're having that type of insomnia, be sure to do something about that, and then maybe check out and see whether there's any depression as well.
And I would just add to that, certainly in my experience, having depression is sort of like, having the brakes go on your car, that you oftentimes don't notice it. Somebody else does when they drive your car, and they're like, dude, your brakes don't work. But it's gradual, so you don't notice when it's happening. And so very often, you're in a better position to see the symptoms and have concerns about somebody around you. But all too often, people don't say anything because they think, oh, it's not my business, or I shouldn't get involved, or I should butt out, because we somehow think that mental illness is different than physical illness. And if you had a friend that had a wound on the side of their face or something, you wouldn't not say anything or say, oh, that's none of my business. You'd say, you're bleeding. Are you okay? And so, we have to treat those two things equally.
I think in regard to the medication questions, and I'll address the menopause separately, to answer the question about are antidepressants for life, the answer is sometimes. I think from our perspective, our goal is to do periodic checks and maybe periodic times of decreasing doses. You rarely want to stop an antidepressant immediately. If you are going to stop, it should be gradually titrated downward. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that, at least annual, if not, I think more frequently than that, is very important to determine if it's needed. Sometimes depression is situational. Sometimes it is a chronic condition, and we should be treating it accordingly. And I will always emphasize that along with any medication should come the counseling and the CBT and the other non-pharmacologic therapies, which are, to me, much more the cure than any medication. So I'll just say that. With regard to menopause, I think you got my bucket analogy earlier. I think about menopause in 3 buckets, because I'm starting it now. You got the vasomotor bucket, which is the hot flashes, the night sweats, and the sleep difficulty. You've got the urogenital bucket, which is, all of a sudden you went to dance at the wedding and you peed your pants, and your vagina's dry, and you don't know what's going on. You don't like sex anymore, things like that. And then you've got the psychological bucket. And the psychological bucket is as important, if not more, than the other 2 buckets. And what I think about is that at this time of life, when the average age is 51, there are so many things happening. The body is changing. The hormones are decreasing. The shift is happening. You are having kids leaving your house. You are taking care of parents. You are responsible for everyone else but yourself. So is depression due to menopause? Maybe. But depression's probably also due to a lot of other things that are happening. And hormones can be helpful, but they may not be the answer. In fact, in some cases, they could be harmful if they're used for too long, as Judy will tell us. I think that to me, it's an important when we've done some studies looking at patients, we ask them to think about it in these buckets and how can we specifically address the symptoms you are having for menopause, because the symptoms you are having are different than the symptoms I am having. And it's like going through a pregnancy. Everybody has a baby at the end. Every woman's going to go through menopause, but how they have that baby and how they go through that menopause is very different.
I think we have time for one more question. It is almost 8:15, and I want to respect all of your time.
As a person who's struggled with mental illness for a lot of my life, I wonder how you address the whole issue of stigma. Stigma, family, church, friends, how you talk about it, how you bring it up, what you say.
So yeah, and thank you for asking that question. I believe that stigma is the single biggest threat to people's mental health that there is, and it's a roadblock that prevents people from accessing care. So even if we have the best doctors and the best inpatient unit and the best drugs, the best therapy approaches, none of it matters if people are afraid to do it because they're worried if someone's going to judge them or they're going to get discriminated against or lose their job. The answer to that, I think it varies from person to person. I don't think that, billboard campaigns or, public service announcements are the answer. I really think that the answer is for people to just decide today, I'm going to start treating this matter of factly. I made a decision to finally come out about my bipolar, 4 years ago at a talk here on campus, and the chancellor and the dean and we're all sitting at the front table, and I thought, well, here goes career suicide. But I was just sick of, living in shame and for something that wasn't my fault. It's just a disease. You get it like somebody gets arthritis, big deal. And so people only, the thing with mental illness is that it's invisible. And so you only see the sick ones. And so you think bipolar and you always think the people who are sick, the guy that is harassing you, at the off-ramp, on the highway, or Charlie Sheen, or, or the crazy neighbor that was like shouting at you at 3 a.m, because your dog went to the bathroom in his yard. And you think, oh, that's bipolar, because the people who are doing well are invisible and blend in. And so we only know what better looks like if we out ourselves. And so it's hard to do. And I'll tell you, it still scares me and makes me nervous to label myself that way. But that's the commitment I've made anyway. Learn about it. Yeah. Learn about it, read about it, understand it, because otherwise we're all operating under these, perceptions that, have been developed over a lifetime, and very, very often they're wrong. And so, just, understanding someone that, that has meant the world to me when people close to me have invested time to learn about bipolar and really know what it is and what it isn't.
Very healing.
Can I just make one comment?
Yes.
I haven't heard any reference to the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and they have a very good education and support program. So that's, and the lady that wanted to know what she could do, that would be a good place to start too, because people go there and they tell their stories.
Thank you for bringing that up. They're a wonderful group. And I think it's NAMI.org is their web address.
It is 8:15. Our videographer, Brian Less, has said that if anybody in this audience does not want to be on the camera, to please come and let us know, and we will make sure that happens. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. Drive home safe, please.